The views of the host do not necessarily equate the views of the guests or vice versa. This podcast is not intended to act as a clinical diagnosis or an authoritative halachic source. Any questions regarding treatment should be directed to your clinician, and any halachic questions should be addressed to your local Orthodox rabbi. We also encourage you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and rate our podcast on iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Your support helps increase visibility and allows us to reach more listeners who can benefit from our wonderful guest speakers.
This is Rabbi Ben-Zion Schaefer of the Shmooze.com. Jewish adulting is about shining a light on parts of ourselves in order to do Avodas Hashem with all the tools and resources at our disposal. It is an honor and a privilege to have every day to further refine our character and grow closer to Hashem. Take advantage of these opportunities before it's too late.
Hello, everybody. This is Chadva Rose, your Jewish Adulting podcast host. I'm here today with very special guest, Simi Mandlebaum. She is the CEO of Prosper Financial Wellness. Today, we're going to talk about, finances and wellness, but let's first talk about Simi and, where she comes from. And Simi, if you could please tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a certified financial therapist, which is very different than your general, you expect to go to a financial person and they're going to tell you spend less than you make and invest in your future and all the regular things. But I have a feeling that you're going to tell us something a little bit different. And that's what I'm excited to hear more about today. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. And this little journey goes back about almost 10 years ago. So I was very comfortable in my life, or I should say, I understood how to be discomfortable with struggling and financing. So money was a struggle. I was single mom of 5 kids, and I knew how to struggle really well. And so when I got married to this wonderful person who, in my perception, wasn't using money wisely, we started having a lot of stress between the two of us. And I'm like, hey, which one of us is right? One of us have to be right. And so I started looking into who can help us with figuring out our finances. There are great organizations that could give you a spreadsheet, but we were a little more complex. Second marriage, different age children, yada, yada, all the things that come along with the complexities. And they couldn't really talk to us about what is normal, standard, who's right, who's wrong. They were just like, well, if it works, it works. And I was like, what do you mean? I still don't think you should be buying pre-washed grapes for double the price, even if we have money in the account. Why would you why disrespect money? And I saw that it was really getting in between the two of us. And so I went back to school to study the psychology of money. And that's where financial therapy really took off for me. There are very few in North America. It is a growing trend now, but there are very few because really what you're using is 2 parts of your brain. Therapy is like the intuition, the people skills, all that part. And the service, the wanting to do good. And then you have the other part, which is the numbers, totally cross the other side. So most of the time, people are stronger with one than the other. For me, it was that intuition, but I always liked money. I remember really early on having, when I was in 7th grade, going on a trip to California for the summer to a friend and going with an envelope. No one ever taught me anything, but I was writing the numbers on the back and keeping the receipts. Ridiculous. I have no idea why. No one taught it. That's just what I was like. I was always watching it and it was interesting to me. And so this was an interesting area. I continued my degree, got a financial counselor degree, a financial coach, and at this point, a financial behavioral specialist. So I'm really familiar with money mindsets because guess what, guys? Money is 90% emotional and only 10% logical. So the way we spend, save, or even earn money has a lot more to do with our personalities than it does with a logical, really good spreadsheet.
Right. So actually, you said something that is a great lead into this conversation, which is that, you mentioned that nobody taught you to have an envelope and write down the receipts. But how would you say our childhood and the learned behaviors of our childhood have an impact and shape the financial decisions that we make? Because, if there's an abundance or a lack or a balance, what are we talking about in terms of what it teaches us?
That is such a super question, because what I love to describe our mindsets is that when we come in and we think about money, the way we think about it is through this lens of our exposure to it, whether it's the community, how we grew up and the family grew up, what the values are that we heard, what our experiences is, all shapes how we view money. And we come to this idea of what money is. Then if we're in a relationship, now we've got another person who has a whole nother idea, right? And then we're both wondering like, no, I have it right. Well, yours is half right. So I like to describe it in the way that we can have a computer, right? We can open a program with two different softwares. But very often we're thinking that our software is the only way to actually get the program to run. And so that's what I like to teach when it comes to money mindsets, because that is true. Our money mindsets is a collection of our experiences, our culture, our ethnicity, our community, all of that shapes us for who we are.
Right. So actually, I'm in IT, and in IT, there is actually multiple ways to open one document, right? You can open it as a PDF, you could open it as a Word, you could open it, there's integrations with a bunch of different softwares. And so what it sounds like is, depending on the emotional patterns that you learn in your life, that's going to be the way that you open that same document or use that same money that, let's say, somebody else might not. So just to take that a step further, how are you going to integrate, the patterns that you have learned with your, let's say, partner's patterns, if that's the case, to make it manageable? But I think that question is actually premature, right? I don't think we're there yet, because I want to know more about, what have you noticed, what have you observed about people making decisions based on this learned behavior?
So first of all, I want to tell you, where you mentioned that the experience a person has is how they're going to use money, or their perception, how we said it before. It's either I'm going to do exactly as I saw, or I'm going to do exactly as I don't want to do what I saw. And it's much harder to come to that gray area of a medium balance. So if someone saw, for example, if they grew up in a really stressful, money was a stress, they saw their parents fight about bills, they had to hide what they purchased, you may either find them to be extremely frugal and fearful of money, or you may find them to be extremely important to them to spend without not worrying and not know what's happening, because I won't want to be that person. So you're asking me, how does it manage between a partner? And I'm saying very often we struggle within ourselves. We have a part of our money mindset that might be a saver part, and we like to have security and have something as saving. And then there's another strong part that's giving or spontaneous. And so even in our own brain, we struggle with, like, how much do I give? How much should I save? Today I was good. Yesterday I wasn't. How do we make those decisions, right? What information? So there's that component. And now we meet someone else. And usually I say that we have what I use is about 6 money personalities, money mindsets. You could have money scripts or money personalities. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I generally use these 6 money personalities. They're saver, spontaneous, security, spontaneous, status, giving, planning, and carefree. Those are the 6 ones. And usually there's one of them that your partner has that was what connected you. Like, you probably have other ones. If a person we all have a part of these 6, but sometimes due to the situation that we're in, it will show up. So for example, someone could be a very spontaneous, carefree person, and then their spouse dies, and now they're responsible for money. And now they take this assessment again, and you'll see high security and planning, because now they're really fearful about their money. So it also depends on the situation you're in, or the partner that you're with. A different experience will show up for you, right? And so really learning each other's personality, and being curious about it and finding out where it came from and how they see it sort of softens your approach to each other. And that's really what I'm working on, because you're not necessarily going to see each other's way of life, but it's learning how to blend it. It's learning how to know that I have a big goal. We both want the big goal. We both want to have, I don't know, an apartment in Israel, or we both want to have a lot in savings, or we both want to have good experiences. But how I get there may be different for both parties.
Right. So I would say that up there in the top stressors. You know, they have a list of things that cause extreme stress. And finances, I don't know what number it is on this top hierarchy, but it's up there. I mean, if you look at it from this perspective of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's the need that allows us to have food and shelter and it actually helps a lot of people with the top of the hierarchy with in terms of self-actualization. Like if you have the money and you have a home and you have a steady job and you're able to buy all your things, then you're able to go to learn and you don't have to think about money all the time. And you're like, there's a menuchas nefesh that comes from having financial security, right? But on the same time, my father always says any problem that it just needs money is not really a problem, right? And it's not like, you know, my father is retired. He's on a he's on a social security income. It's not like money is just free flowing, but that mentality of the pressure, the sheer financial pressure that we have. My question about that is, so one hand we have that where it's learned behavior and it's also personality, right? So it's learned behavior, it's personality. What impact does the society, and specifically Jewish society, because that's kind of the thing, how do we put that stress on ourselves and each other? What does that kind of pressure do to a person? And do you even think it has any impact?
Okay, so I'd like to go back. You were saying that stress is really high on that totem pole. The APA in 2022 put out a study that says 77% of Americans across the board are stressed in relationships to do with money. So you're right, it's a really high percent. And talking about that need, that there's this element of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, I love that thought because what is a need and what is a want is usually where I start. We need to eat, but how much do we need to eat? We need to buy clothing, but what type of clothing do we actually need to buy? So it goes back to what your dad said, what your father said, where it's like, well, if money could save it, if money could fix it, then it's not really a problem at all, right? It sounds pretty nice. So where does Jewish society fall in here? Well, the American culture and the Jewish culture is vastly different. They have a really low percentage allocated towards tuition. They don't have private schools. And so what about entertainment camps? A lot of our Jewish society has expenses that are much higher. We also have a larger amount, depending on the income bracket, but we tend to see that people that earn a little bit more money usually have more help for their children. They like to get their children more, whether it's assistants and tutors or whether it's clubs and hobbies, they really invest a lot in their children. I'm not saying that the American culture doesn't, but in contrast, that is a stress. We're also living in a community usually that might have someone very poor near us, and right next door to us, maybe someone who looks like they're living very richly. And I say living very richly because having wealth and living rich are totally two different things, right? So it depends where we live. Are we in a complex that has a lot of different homes that the people are sitting around mingling and noticing what each kid is wearing, and there's some sort of like looked upon that now we call it the Joneses or the status that's important to fit in. We all want to fit in, but who are we surrounding ourselves to fit in? I had a client yesterday and he was saying, you know, he's making a nice amount of money. And he was like, you know, I was thinking maybe I should buy he's pretty young. And he said, maybe, you know, I was looking at a house for 1.2 million, which is not too much. I'm just thinking about the expenses that's going to cost me per month. We're going through some numbers. And then I asked him to draw me a vision board of what if he looks financially successful in the future, what it would look like. And he drew me this beautiful picture. And around the picture, I said to him, circle, what is your number one priority in that picture? And it was his children. And I asked him how much of his money is being spent towards working his children, how he sees them in the future. And if he bought that house, would that impact their way of growing up? He wanted them to be independent, or he wanted them to be successful. Well, would they feel entitled if they were around people? Is that $1.2 million very simple area, and a $3 million house would make it work? So really just giving people the ability to step back and consider what their values are, so that when they're looking at their money, they're looking at it from like, if I had all the money in the world, how would I use it? And now I drill back down. to make sure I'm on that path. Even if I don't have it now, I know where I want to put my energy in. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And what it's basically saying is, are the financial purchases that I'm making at this point in time actually fulfilling what I want to do? Do I even have a vision, or am I just reacting? Am I just spending like reactively? And will that actually meet a goal? Did I set a goal? It's kind of like, I like that idea of a vision board, because if you say at the end of the day, my children are the most important thing to me, and them having strong values, well, maybe living in a community where the homes are multi-million-dollar homes, is that going to impart the value that you wanted? Maybe it will. I'm not saying it won't. I'm not. It's not a judgment. It's just that at least you're being mindful about it.
Consideration, because I think a lot of people will say, like, I want to give my kids the experience I never had if they grew up struggling. That's a very common theme.
Yeah.
And at the expense of the children growing up so self-absorbed and not understanding life and money. And then at one point, teen years, the parents are like, I don't know what I created. I created this monster who has expectations of everything, because now it got even larger. So I think that's where this really comes into play.
Right. I actually call it keeping up with the cones, right? Where that was actually a topic I really wanted to cover, because I think that there is so much pressure, like you said, in the community, where the person next door to you might be a child, and they have a bunch of children and they're struggling, but this is the life that they value and that they lead, and there's nothing wrong with it. But then next door is someone who everyone's wearing matching everything, and the vacations that they go on and the Yom Tovim they go away. It can create a disconnect for the child. Like, which value should I have if the people around me are having one value and my family is having another value? How am I going to bridge that gap, especially because we all live near the shuls and we all live in the same Dalit Amos of the resources that we need?
And that's why I think it's so important that the parents are the anchor of the home. And how they react, how they think, what I call it the money mantras you hear as a child. Like, you may hear your parents say, learning is the most important thing, but yet at the Shabbos table, we're going to talk about everyone's new houses and new things, right? So what is the information? What are the money mantras you're hearing growing up? Well, convenience is the most important thing. So it doesn't matter what you spend. Convenience is important because time is more important, right? Yeah. So those are the messages you want to look out for, because that's really what's going to impact the kids. Yes, the kids have their own personality and they'll pick up. I love this study that I'm doing in the business, which is very often I'll ask the oldest and the youngest of a family their experience of money, grew up in the same family, and their experience is totally different. For the most part, the oldest had a more difficult time because the parents weren't as established yet. And they tend to have different money personalities than the youngest, who usually had very little issue with money. Money wasn't the topic. So it's the same thing. It's not only the place that they are in the home, it's how the home is, it's how their own personality, how they absorb the information.
Right. You could always say, like, the oldest kid is like, I never had a phone. And the youngest one is like, I absolutely need a phone. The oldest one doesn't get a car when they're 16. And the youngest one, there's already like 3 cars in the house, because I completely hear that as we grow older and become more stable, that children get different messages about money. So that definitely, but what I find very interesting about this conversation that keeps running in my mind is that, okay, now I know that I spend, I spend like this because I had this particular background. Like, my home, we were not wealthy growing up and we didn't do extracurricular activities. And so that's very important to me now, but that's not necessarily in the budget. How am I now integrating the responsible financial decisions of, that everyone says spend less than you make, when emotionally I want my child to be able to go to singing lessons and camp and all the things that I lacked as a child? How do I balance that intense, emotional reaction to my child's financial needs?
So it sounds almost like there's a trigger. Like, I really want something that's not in a line with the numbers on my paper. Am I getting that right?
Yes, exactly.
I'd like to share a study with you, if I may.
Yes, please.
It was a study done. It was called Universal Basic Income. And the premise was, that they felt that people that are struggling never have the opportunity to really succeed in life. So they were wondering if they give the people a certain amount of money per month, will the people then have the ability to do better and increase their education, make more money, and have opportunities? And so they tried it. They had one group that was receiving, I think, $500 or $1,000 a month. The other group that was receiving a much lower amount, maybe 50, just to participate in the study. And what they found after it was a 3-year, and to me, I'd be actually interested if this went on to 5 years because I have my own premises on it. But what they found was that most of the people's balance sheets were worse than when they started. But the way they felt about their finances were higher. They felt more at peace. They felt more calm. They felt like they had a better experience with their money, even though the numbers were worse. And when you looked at those balance sheets, you saw they took a little more vacations, they took off of time of work, they spent time with their family. So those are the two components in life. There's one component is how do I feel about my money? And the other one is like, what is actually going on in my money? Does it make any sense?
It sure does. Yeah.
So back to that question, where you want something that it doesn't look like it fits on those numbers. I'd be curious to, have we actually looked at the numbers on other areas to see if there's something that we could do differently? Have we looked at other opportunities that possibly we could have some revenue coming in so that we can make that a reality? Because it's not how much we have, but how we feel about the money that makes an impact in our life. And very often people will come to me after they made a wedding stressed out and almost shameful because now they're in debt. And sometimes they're in debt because the other side wanted a nicer wedding. And for the sake of shalom, which is a stronger value to them, they're in debt. We want to remember that Hashem sends us. Hashem sends us what we are doing our hishtadlus. Ultimately, we're not 100% in control of everything that comes in. But if we believe we're going in the right direction, we're making the right choices, we're doing the right things, we're not taking on debt. I'm not here to promote debt, but we're doing the best we can. I think you might have a little ease of mind. Maybe in order to be a great singer, you have to do it 3 times a week. But you know what? Maybe now we could do once a week. Something that you have these stepping stones that it makes you feel more aligned with what your value is, but it's not the whole thing that you would have loved to see. Is it?
Yes. So it goes back to that whole values. I actually had a friend who she is a single woman and she works pretty hard and she uses all of her money for experiences. She wants a very experiential life. And so she's cheap and she doesn't like to spend money on anything except she goes on, she travels and this is what she wants to do with her money. And it brings her that sort of joy that she's saying, my value is I want to have experiences. And I know that I'm going to have to cut corners in other areas of my life. And, and she really does, I'm not saying that it's all good because that in and of itself could be a problem. I don't know. But that idea that you want to really pick up what your emotional value and emotional, religious, spiritual values are.
I spend a lot of time in that place more than I spend the time to understand generational trauma, generational understanding, cultural. So a lot of what I see from our religion, our Holocaust survivors, the fact that we were in exile in so many different places and had to start fresh is a generational entrepreneurship that we have over a lot of other cultures and communities. And that comes into play in our money a lot, right? So the way we see
it's like there's like waves. There's waves of prosperity and then there's waves of in a way you could say that that's what's keeping the spark alive for that, like you said, entrepreneurship spirit, right? If we had generational wealth, because there were times that we had plenty of wealth, a lot of Europeans were very wealthy. And then they lost everything and they came here and their entrepreneurship was strong and their desire to create a better world was strong. And it's almost like those waves are what keeps that, I guess you could say the belief that Jews, only care about making money alive because we want to connect. I'm very interested in this idea that generational trauma has an impact on finances. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So what we know is, and if I'll see clients that are one generation after Holocaust or two generations after Holocaust, there's a different experience that they had. They probably were much more cognizant about their money. They were much more careful. There was a lot of thought that went into it. Frugality was important. Education was important. Succeeding was important. There was a lot of emphasis. Like, you got to work hard. A lot of, maybe a little bit less towards humanness, like taking it easy or having self-compassion. That wasn't viewed upon as necessarily a virtue. It was like hard work is where we're at. And you can see the difference if there were many generations American didn't have that experience. I have the clients that come in that were either multi-generational Americans. They just didn't have that experience. They grew up in a more stable environment where, you can work for someone else or you can work for yourself. It's okay. The European was like, they struggled if they went to work and had a 9 to 5 job and got let go. They had to create their new systems that worked for the Jewish family. And we have that. We have a lot of that, which actually brings me to an interesting thing that I noticed, because a lot of my clients are entrepreneurs. And although we deal with personal finance, I noticed that there was a disconnect between money and their entrepreneurship. And I was like, something is missing in my system of what I'm doing. And I noticed that there's a neurodivergency, I want to say, which is, maybe we want to call it ADHD, and I don't need to label it, but there's a disconnect with the way numbers feel, what's happening with it and the way I'm acting towards it. Because sometimes in entrepreneurship, we're risk takers. So we're comfortable taking on debt. We have a bigger vision. We believe on the next step. But in personal finance, it doesn't really work so well that way. If, like, I'm taking my credit card debt and I'm just hoping for the next deal tomorrow, that is a recipe for a lot of anxiety for maybe the neurotypical person. And so I started really studying and being curious about how much of America it affects and how much of the Jewish community affects. And so it's a 3 to 5% in Americans, but actually 15% Israel is where I heard this at the ADHD conference, has about 15% is what they study.
Oh, wow.
And think about it. Someone who's neurodivergent is usually fabulous when it comes to leadership, when it comes to vision, when it comes to ideas. They're focused. They can hyper focus. They can really get somewhere a neurotypical person struggles with a lot more. But personal finance is where it comes to me. So
right. So how does financial therapy differ from financial planning? Let's say in this arena where you're not telling them a balance sheet and how they need to budget. You're talking about either their ADHD symptoms or their emotional triggers, or you're talking about a lot of things. Tell me about how it differs, what your process is a little bit more.
Well, actually, you're right. A financial therapist can, and many do, just work with the trauma or the emotional component. And very many financial therapists have a different home base. Maybe they're a therapist that now have financial therapy on top, or they're a financial advisor that now has financial therapy on top. But my home base is financial therapy. And so what I did in this business is I married the spreadsheets to the behaviors. So those spreadsheets and those numbers tell me if the behaviors that we're working on is working, because the numbers are moving in the direction that we're working towards. So a financial planner is generally going to help you make a long-term plan for your future, maybe tax sheltering, maybe figuring out where to allocate your money, and they may get a percent or they charge a fee. As a financial therapist, I have no vested interest in your money. I charge the same amount, whether you're a billionaire or you're struggling. My fee remains the same. And so people feel very comfortable when they come to me and we create a spending plan, not budget. I don't like that word. We create that spending plan, because when we finish creating the spending plan and now we know what we have left over to put away, or we make that decision, they now can go to financial advisor and feel very confident that the financial advisor is not advising them to put away too much money because they get AUM, which is assets under management. They get a percentage, or they're more aggressive. They feel comfortable. So I'm like the step before the financial advisor. I'm like the socks for the shoes.
Okay. That's a nice analogy. I do want to go back to two things you said. One thing that you said was, when we talk about, our values and things that are important to us in our vision board, let's say, What do you feel about the Pirkei Avos where it says you're supposed to kaneh lecha chaver, supposed to buy for yourself a friend? Where's that on the vision board? How does that come into play for you?
That is a fabulous question. And because I'm in research and science, I see this on the flip side. And so what we say is that you are a sum of the five people you hang around most. So you want to make sure that the five people you're hanging around most are the people that are of your value. And you should always have your gut. You should have one person that's one step ahead of you, or many people that are one step ahead of you, that you study them, you learn them, you really get to know them, if possible, even have conversation. But that will really get you in that direction. I always say that our money will land where our eye lands. If I'm focused on how am I going to manage today, then I'm not going to save for my future. If I focus on I want to have a comfortable future, then today doesn't mean as much. Does that make any sense? Like your friend who,
Yeah.
like her experiences are the most important thing. And so she's doing it. So sometimes, and it's normal for our values to change because values, I like to describe them as like a reed, like they move with the wind. They're not inflexible. Inflexible is a goal. If a client comes to me and says, I want to make $1 million next year, can you help me figure that out? And we figure that out. And we didn't take into account anything else. They may come back in a really unhappy place. Yeah, they got their $1 million, but they gave up their family. They no longer have lives. Their kids are not talking to them, yada, yada, yada. That's a goal, really inflexible. A value, sometimes my experience of life makes me shift. Like I knew I had a value of a clean house when I was a single mom. I really liked the clean house. It made my brain feel organized. It made me feel like I can tackle anything. But I also had a value that I wanted my kids to have friends in my house under my jurisdiction. So I see what's happening and make sure that my house is the best house possible. So my value shifted, right? And that's what happens to us in life. As we grow up, we may say right now, the most important thing is X. You know what? Let me reassess. And so it's important to do, whether you have that mentor or whether you do cheshbon hanefesh and introspection biannually or annually, where you're like, hey, where am I at today? Because you're not the same person you were 10 years ago. So doesn't mean you have to have the same values.
Right. Right. When you have people who are on the extreme side, let's say hoarders or people who use money just excessively, or like you said, have these values that are rigid and destroy. What is your, let's say, approach and obstacles in dealing with that individual?
So when someone is married to a certain belief, it's challenging to have them look at that belief as separate from themselves. So if I feel like I'm an anxious person, I feel like I'm an anxious person. That's who I am. But if I'm able to take Mr. Anxious and put him on a paper and start talking to him in a way where I'm curious, because I know Mr. Anxious is there to protect me. That's the one thing I know. He's there for me to succeed in life, to feel protected. Any part of us that's very strong is there for the good. It really has every good intention. But if I don't realize that it's an advisor and not a dominator, then it dominates my life. And so what I like to do with my clients is try to have them separate it, put it on a paper. Let's really give it a name, a look, a vision. Tell me about how that is. What is it protecting you from? What could you prove to it that you may not need the protection anymore? And that's how we really work with it.
That really sounds like internal family systems, but with money.
It's a component. Yeah, it's a component in IFS and a component with kinetic, like quantum physics. Quantum physics says that when something's looked at, it shifts and changes no matter what. So they have something called the double slit experiment, which what they did was they had a slit and put atoms through it. And what they noticed was the atoms created a pattern, but when the camera went on it, the pattern actually changed. So when it was studied, it shifted. And so that's really what our life is. When we put down Mr. Anxiety, Mr. Hoarder, Mr. Fear, Mr. Abundance, and no cure, we want to talk to it. What is it trying to tell us? Tell me, I'm curious about what would it say if it could talk?
Wow. I just feel like my mind blew a little bit because there's something like I'm working on with my therapist is this idea of your coping skills are are there for a reason, and then they serve you and then they stop serving you, right? And so let's say you were extremely capable all the time, as as you're trying to overcome whatever obstacles you have, and then that extreme ability to cope and to deal and to be is becomes an obstacle to getting other things that you want in your life and other values that are important. So with you saying this, it's like, oh, it's that same idea that, maybe now I'm hoarding because before that was a way of like coping, but no longer do I need to hoard, but I need to thank that part of myself that helped me cope. And it's not bad. It's not good. It is good. It was good for me at that time, and it's no longer good for me. So that's why I feel like, oh, wow, she's talking about, what me and my therapist talked about the other day. So that's really interesting. And then the other thought that I had was going to tzedakah. And then we'll kind of end with this because I want you to have your Thanksgiving Day, however you're going to be celebrating, if it's with your family or working, as it sounds like you will. But, I do want to honor your time. Let's talk about charity for a minute. So we know that tzedakah is an integral part of Yiddishkeit, integral part of Judaism. And there are different levels of tzedakah. And one of the things I heard you say earlier that now make me think, when you give tzedakah, you're supposed to give family, then friends, then community, then, outside the community. It's like there's a hierarchy within even the tzedakah giving world. But then you also mentioned that people who were given money were actually, like, their situation, they spent the money the same way in terms of their habits not changing. So let's say you have a family member who is financially struggling and you want to give them money. And yet the way that they react to money is they spend as much as they can because they are reacting to the way they grew up, or they don't have the money. And so there's a whole like emotional component to it. Now, I know you're not a rabbi, but if you give this person money, they will spend the money on the same things that they've been spending it until now and mismanaging their money in you can't give tzedakah and expect people to use it the way that you want. But you also recognize that in this financial psychology framework, that you might give somebody money and they might misuse the funds based on their triggers. What do you say to people who are in that position, that they're giving money to friends or family or even communities, to be honest with you, where the funds it's questionable if they will be used in the way that you intended?
Yeah. And, you mentioned tzedakah, but I would say, what about supporting children? Sometimes you support children, and we've done a study in our business where we tracked about 50 young couples, some of which were supported and some of which were not. And we looked at their numbers to compare them. And what we noticed was the people that were supported, those couples, they spent a lot more money than the ones that were not supported. And their other expenses were entertainment and gifts that didn't exist on the other couple. So here you are thinking that parents are supporting a learning couple, and really we're looking at the numbers and we're seeing a different story, right? And so I think that part, and I just want to stop to say, I love our religion. I honestly love it. I was at a conference last week and they were talking about, what you got to do with money. You got to save it and spend it, but you got to make sure you're saving enough. And I'm like, one second. What happened to giving? Like, what happened to tithing? What happened to charity? Not everyone has this beautiful gift and this beautiful value that we have. And in our business, it's very often we have people that want to save 20%, not just 10%. And what they're not noticing is that if they're going into debt every month, their 20% ain't no 20%. It's 40% of your income. So let's have a conversation first. Are you planning on supporting everyone with 40% of your income? Right? So there's a lot of different parts of charity. But as far as what it's doing, we're not in control. We're not in this world to make control. We're here to do our duties. If it makes you feel better because you're a controlling personality, maybe sometimes I'm a controlling personality, maybe get something for that money. You want to help them, provide them, go get them a grocery order, pay a bill, do something that's direct if it makes you feel better, if that's what you feel like you need to do in order to feel good about yourself.
Right. Well, I mean, tzedakah is not supposed to be necessarily just about yourself. It's a complicated, it is a complicated conversation. You know, what can you use your miser for? And then how much of control do you want over that? How much should you let go? It is a very complicated question. I was just curious in the understanding that, you know, that people have limitations with their money, that if they got more money, they might still be, you're not necessarily helping the situation because of these psychological, I don't want to say, yes, packages is exactly the right way to say it. Now I have so many more questions, but I'm not going to ask you them because this is all the time that we have. I really want to thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. You're not as scary as I thought you would be.
I do want to put out there, guys, that whoever is in a second relationship, there is a component of charity that if you're in a relationship and you mingle your money, so husband and wife mingle the money, a certain part of the money that the husband earns for the wife's children can be used towards charity as well. He has no responsibility legally, halakhically for your children. So be mindful, you know, people are not aware that things are shifted if there's a second relationship. Be mindful of that if that's relevant. But yeah, again, charity, like you say, it's not about our feelings. It's we're doing what we're meant to do. And sometimes a lot of that time, I mean, our religion, a lot of times, do we understand everything? No, but we know that there's a higher value, a higher reason, and we're doing what we're meant to do with our money. We're a steward of the money. It's not our money. It's passing through. We're here to really be good stewardships of the money.
Right. So in conclusion, if you had to give our listeners one piece of advice or one thing to look at or one thing to think about from this podcast about evaluating and like looking at habits and spendings and triggers, what would your one piece of advice be?
Think about your enough. What's enough for you? Because, I mean, you can go on our website. We have a game called My Enough. And what I notice is if your enough is always on the higher number, like when it comes to apartments, I need to have a 5-bedroom house. When it comes to fish, I need to have sea bass or sushi. And everything is on that higher amount, you're going to find people that are really unhappy because they're aiming for everything being perfect. I want you to consider what is enough for you. Do you know what is enough? Because sometimes that enigma makes you keep pushing in a direction that may not even be of value.
I love that. Okay, we're going to definitely put your website into why don't you say the website now and we're going to put it into the podcast notes?
Okay, it's www.prosper, PROSPR, no E, no excuses, .fit. FIT, like fitness, FIT.
Wonderful. We're going to definitely share that. People could be in touch with you if they want to use your services. This has been so interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a really nice day and hopefully we'll be in touch.
And I'm glad I'm not that intimidating. Thanks for having me.
I always tell my truth. This is my truth. That I was intimidated, but I'm not anymore because you're a very nice person. You made me feel very comfortable. So thank you.
Oh, good.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye-bye.